about tonight, what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight was um, something that I've talked with you a little bit about before, which is the sort of journey, if you like, that I'm going through at the moment in my own teaching practice. And one of the aspects of that is a sort of coming back to a little bit of research about languages, teaching and learning. So I've got a pretty sort of ungainly title for the talk, which is Things from Applied Linguistics That Languages Teachers Need to Know, and a first-hand account of abandoning the teaching of grammar. Hopefully, I won't be too loquacious, and there'll be a bit of time for questions and chat at the end. And so here we go. Can someone just confirm for me that you can see a nice image of Monteriggioni in Tuscany on your screen at the moment?
Yes, we can.
Beautiful. Thanks, Melissa. I have peppered through this presentation different photos of mine of Italy because we can't travel, so it's a little bit of yearning, a little bit of nostalgia. I want to start with this idea of a tree with many branches. Here's a nice photo of the shore of the Po River, just outside Parma in Emilia-Romagna. One of the things about languages is, and if we sort of think about languages as an area of the curriculum, there's this really strong tendency to think about things as if they're completely separate. So, languages in this box, maths in that box, etc. And even in the way we approach languages, there's a bit of a tendency to think about the different ways of thinking about languages as if they were all separate. But in fact, I like to think of it more as a tree with many branches. And what I've got on the screen there is, this is sort of well known and often well remarked in a lot of sort of scholarly work that people that are in languages teaching don't necessarily look at what the applied linguists are doing. Yet the applied linguists work on languages, teaching and learning. People in translation studies don't necessarily talk to people that are teaching languages. So, instead of a tree with many branches, it ends up as a wood pile with bits of wood sheared off all over the place. So one of the first things one of my first sort of invitations to you is to actually try to think about how different areas that are related to languages can actually inform what we do as languages educators. A topic I like talking about a little bit. I'm going to talk about myself, me, myself, and I. I'm Gemini, so there's definitely two of me, maybe a few more. When I sit down and calculate the amount of time I've been teaching for, I become very scared because actually I had to do the maths a couple of times today because I was going, no, is that possible? Next year, it's actually 30 years since I formally began teaching Italian. I know that's difficult to believe because, yes, I was clearly a toddler when I began teaching Italian, but it is actually the truth. In 1992 was when I began teaching Italian for the first time. I've always been a sort of languages enthusiast. You may have heard this anecdote before, but when I was 10, the thing that I asked for my birthday was a dictionary. Other 10-year-olds were asking for, I don't know, a BMX or whatever it might have been. I wanted a dictionary. I've always had a really strong linguistic focus. I've always been interested in words. I love grammar. One of my favourite things to do is collect grammar books, grammars of Italian particularly, and I just read them. I just love that. And what's really interesting was that's how I thought I'd learned Italian. I thought that I'd learned Italian in a classroom via a typical sort of textbook explicit teaching of grammar methodology. The reason for that is that in my early adulthood at university, I ended up taking Italian sort of on the tail end of my first degree, which was music. I ended up starting to study Italian, and I started as a beginner. And so for the longest time, I was convinced that that's actually how I learned Italian. But, and I think you've probably heard bits and pieces of this before, in the last sort of 5-10 years or whatever, I had a sort of realization that actually things don't sort of add up. The first thing that doesn't add up is my Italian's, and I'm not being boastful when I say this. My Italian's good, and it's good for someone like me who doesn't come from an Italian background. I have a very my mother was born in England. My father had a crack at learning Italian for a while. Yeah, but it wasn't pretty. So let's just put it that way. So I don't come from a language sort of rich sort of background. But actually I do, because for the first 4 to 5 years of my life, we lived next to an Italian family. Their child was the same age as me. We sort of started to really socialise when I was a year old, and when my neighbour was a year old. I was a vivacious, very active small child, and basically went next door to the Italians for about 5 years. So in my early childhood, I had an enduring, immersive sort of contact in this Italian-speaking environment. I saw that family about 10 years ago. The parents, particularly the mother, spoke no English still, after all of these years. What was really interesting was I just spoke Italian when I was with the family. Their son was there, who I haven't kept in contact with. I just found him on social media and realised that I lived up the road from his parents, so I went round for a visit. I just spoke Italian while I was there. The son doesn't speak Italian. So a strange irony, because the little boy next door experienced this sort of linguistic imprinting that really conditioned me for the rest of my life. So when I did come back to it, like if I look at my life carefully, there's been all of these moments where I've had the opportunity to do something, and I've always gone for the Italian sort of thing, whatever it might have been. I loved Italian art, so I did Italian art history in my arts degree. I did a little bit of Italian by correspondence at high school. I was finishing my music degree. I had to do a subject outside the faculty. I chose Italian. So there was something drawing me there, but bizarrely, I'd never made this connection back to those early years. in the last few years, I think probably when I saw you last time, I was talking about a pedagogical crisis. I'm calling it a Damascus way, pedagogical reckoning. You'll remember the Damascus way that conjures the image of Saul on the Damascus way and being struck down with a revelation, and then becoming Paul, who wrote all the books of the Bible or whatever it might be. What I've realised particularly in the last few years, when considering my students' Italian, so I want you to imagine things from my my point of view. That I've got this decades-long dedication to teaching Italian. Okay. I'm a sort of reflective practitioner. I sort of renew what I do all the time. It's not unthoughtful teaching. Yet, I was bemused in the last few years. Oh, hand up over here. Is there a Galaxy A8? Do you want to ask me something? Your hand's up. No? Okay. If you do, just open your mic and talk to me. That's fine. I'm happy for people to just interject. So, back to what I was saying. I'm fairly interested and confident about what I'm teaching, yet I was always bemused because the students just, would make mistakes or, just wouldn't learn things, and it was really confusing for me. It was like, okay, I've tried it this way, I've done it this way, we've done it, I've come back to it, I've taught it again, and on the screen you can see a couple of examples. This is a really interesting one that is really frequent. That first example, del questo libro. Too much is going on. Basically, whoever it is trying to say about this book. Okay, about this book. Now, in Italian, that would be di questo libro. Del questo libro's got the article as well, and you can see I've glossed it in English, of this book. Now, this isn't an error that you ever encounter in English. No one says of this book. So the error can't come from influence from English. They've never heard del questo libro in Italian. Okay, they've never heard that before. Okay, Galaxy A8. Galaxy A8, do you want to ask me a question? Ma. A similar one, in vicino di. So, and I hear this fairly regularly. Again, this is not something you'll ever hear in Italian, so it's not coming from exposure to the Italian language. Maybe this one is influence from English because maybe it's modelled on in the vicinity of. The other ones that always confuse me were getting the articles wrong. So the words for the words for a, and also verb forms, which for many years I taught explicitly, repeatedly, in different ways, came back to them, did it again and again. In fact, the other day, my colleague said, with students that I taught 2 years ago, he was saying he was doing this particular verb tense. Now, I've taught them that verb tense. The person after me taught them that. The person after them taught them that. The person after them has taught them that. And now they're with him and he's teaching them that. So something is not working. Something's just not working. So what's actually going on? But am I actually teaching anyone anything? Am I? The other really big question is there any real change in students' language ability? So, is there anything happening in their time with me? Is there a change? Or are the good students still just good because they were good to begin with? And the weak students, are they still weak because they were weak to begin with? And how can I work out what's happening? So I've gone through a bit of a process, if you like, um, a bit of a process of trying to work through these issues. And I think, and I sort of wanted to share this with you because I think this is something that everyone who's teaching languages should think about. The first one is, what is language learning according to me? What is it that I'm actually hoping that the students will learn? And the follow-up question is, does what I'm doing contribute to this? How do I know what I'm doing contributes to it? And where can I find some good outside perspectives on what I'm doing? I think there are four key questions that we sort of need to be considering, not just once, but on a regular basis. Here are some of the things I've learned. I'm trying to evoke, I was trying to be clever. Rules ain't rules. It's like that old slogan, oils ain't oils. I don't know if you know that one. But, I was reading something the other day, and, languages are complex and difficult to explain. And that's true. And because they're difficult to explain, they're difficult to teach in a way. But think about this. We use languages without being able to explain them. Now, this is an interesting conundrum. There are things about every language that you speak that you will find difficult to explain, but you'll still be able to use that language perfectly without an issue. Now, that example before that, del questo libro, really evokes this idea of the interlanguage, which Selinka is the proponent of this idea from the 70s, that during the learning of a language, during that sort of ongoing journey, if you like, speakers develop something that's like the language that they're learning, but it's not quite right. And that's why I had seen in numerous students at different times this del questo libro, because it's not isolated. It's actually clearly part of the developmental path for learners of Italian, which means it's got nothing to do with me. It's got nothing to do with my teaching. And I can't actually use it as a diagnostic of what I'm doing because it's just part of what happens when someone's learning Italian. Even simple rules aren't simple. I've got an example here. So in English, we might say, to make a noun plural, okay, to make a noun plural, you put an S on the end, okay? We can all think of, exceptions to that rule, like ox and oxen or whatever. But what about when a word just flouts the rule? So we know that trousers is an invariable noun, okay? You just say trousers. The singular isn't meant to exist, but actually it does exist if you read Vogue or any fashion magazine. because they'll type, whatever, a linen trouser. Now, what's going on here? And what's interesting in Italian, okay, so we know, we know this word from Italian, spaghetti. In Italian, it's plural, okay, gli spaghetti, and it's got all of the morphology for being plural. But in restaurants, it's very common for the waiter, when they're bringing you your dish, if you've ordered spaghetti, they'll say, they'll come to the table and go, ecco lo spaghetto. They'll put it in the singular. Now, this is a noun that's not really meant to have a singular. Oh, it has one, but in normal everyday speech, you would never use it. If you say spaghetto, it implies one of those spaghetti, and that's just weird. But in waiter speak, it's common to use the singular of things that are often plural. So can you see the point I'm trying to make is that even when we've got a rule, which is evidently a pretty tight, watertight rule, maybe not. Telling isn't teaching. You know this. And I'm sort of here telling you lots of things tonight. But, I think this is an important thing to remind ourselves, that just because we've presented something, that's not necessarily teaching. Teaching something once doesn't lead to learning. I often am surprised when people say, oh, I can't believe that they don't know that because I taught that 3 years ago. As if there's some sort of way of me getting information from my mouth into your head and it stays there. You'll all know this, that learning often happens despite or in spite of what we do. So, and I don't know if I'm not sure if that is a comfort or if that is, I think it's a comfort, but also a little bit of a warning, if you like. And, I think this is really important as well. Sometimes what I think, it's just not right. So, when I think of what, for all those years I was thinking of my own learning of Italian, and I just had completely the wrong idea about what had actually gone on in my own sort of head, if you like, in my own development. And also my decades-long blind faith in explicit teaching of language. And now I'm unveiling sort of where I'm going with this. For many years, I was absolutely convinced that if I explained this, particular aspect of the language in this detail, in this way, and whatever, that would actually lead to learning. But it's not necessarily the case. Look at that blue sky as it goes past. So what can applied linguistics tell us? Well, in Lightbone and Sparta's 5th edition of How Languages Are Learned, and really this is one book that I really I'm going to recommend 2 books tonight. This is one book that I really recommend that you get your hands on and have a look at. The 5th edition, though, so the latest edition. Have a look at the latest edition. It's just come out. They make the statement that classroom-based research on second language learning and teaching has given us partial answers to many questions. So, in fact, a lot of things are still up for grabs, if you like. We sort of we know bits and pieces about things. But before we consider that, one thing that I think is really important to think about is a mismatch between teaching focus and the stated or the implied aims of languages teaching. Now, this goes right back to my questions before about what you think languages learning is about. I'll just give you an example here. If we look at the VCE, so the Year 12 Italian final examinations in Victoria, one of the things that's interesting, there's two things that are interesting. First, 40% of that exam actually requires English responses. Okay, so this is the written exam. 40% of the written exam is responded to in English. With the oral exam and the remaining part of the written exam, there's never, for many years, there's been no explicit grammar exercises. So there's nothing on those exams. There's nothing that you do at the end of year 12, at the end of at the end of the secondary school cycle. There's nothing that requires you to conjugate a verb, fill in these prepositions, whatever it might be. What there is a focus on comprehension and production of text. So the questions that come to my mind straight away is, if there's no explicit grammar testing, why teach grammar explicitly? And is that teaching going to get us where we need to be with the comprehension and production of texts? This is why it's so important to identify what the goals of your languages teaching and learning are. One thing I've been saying recently is, if you're going to teach grammar, people are going to learn grammar. Is that the same as teaching Italian? And is that the same as learning Italian? And one thing I think is important to consider is first language acquisition and use. There's mounting evidence that the learning development in second languages and additional languages is very similar to first language development. And if that's the case, let's think about how first languages are actually acquired and used. Now, Lightbone and Sparta say there's partial answers to many questions, but actually we do know some things for sure. Some questions have been decided. A bit of an image there, trying to evoke what for some of you might be a flipping of things on its head. So regardless of the theoretical approach, so regardless of the theoretical views of language learning, it is absolutely now the case that there's general consensus that comprehensible input is the raw material needed for language acquisition. So basically what it means is, for our brain to acquire a language, we need a certain type and a certain quantity of input in that language. Comprehensible input, typically communicatively embedded. So language basically in action. Language that means something in a communicative environment. So if that's the case, is a grammar exercise fulfilling that requirement? Probably not. Are a lot of the typical things that we see in languages classrooms going to satisfy this requirement of comprehensible input? There's really no evidence that explicit teaching of a language leads to implicit knowledge. I worked under the impression for many, many years that if I told my student, if I told them, how something worked, if I illustrated what the forms were and if we did, this type of activity, that type of activity, this, that, and the other, that somehow that would go into their head and turn into learning. There's no evidence that that's the case. There is evidence that if I teach students something like that, imagine, I teach them the present tense, okay? If I teach them that, teach them the forms, we do the exercises. If I test them on that in a short time frame, yes, they can respond to that. But that doesn't mean they actually can use that form. The next one I think is really, I think this is really important, and I think it's really important that we understand this. Practicing speaking and writing doesn't improve speaking and writing. So, we work on the adage of practice makes perfect, but actually there's very weak evidence in over 50 years of research to support this position. And the last point, and the reason this one's here is because for many years I was a very strong denier of this. I didn't believe for a second that second language anxiety was a real thing. I just thought people needed to, just relax or something and, just get on with it or whatever. But actually, I've really changed my view on that. And what's really funny is I go back to that point I made earlier where, about sometimes what I think is just not right. If I look at my own experience, a number of years ago I was in where was I? I was in Spain, and I speak Italian fluently. That's fine. I've learned French for a while, so I've got a bit of French under my belt as well. I sort of looked at a bit of Spanish, so I knew a few words here, there, whatever. It was pure terror. Anytime I was in a moment where I was faced with having to say just something banal like a coffee, please, pure terror. I just couldn't say anything. I couldn't even say anything in Italian. And if I just said it in Italian, that would have been fine. So, but what's interesting is I never looked at my own experience of that. Having recently changed my approach, I've really seen how different an approach that reduces anxiety in the classroom can be for students. This is the second book that I'd really recommend for you to consider having a look at, which is Van Patten Smith and Benati, Key Questions in Second Language Acquisition. That's 2020. I'll make sure these. I've got another couple of references as well that I'll make sure Alex distributes for you. So, what do these things mean for you as a languages teacher? And this is where we get to my sort of personal account. So I'm going to explain. So this year, because of the pandemic, I usually teach a number of subjects overseas. And because I can't do that, my teaching load has been redistributed a little bit. And in first semester, I had to take on a subject that I don't usually teach, which is, in our parlance, it's Italian 3, which is sort of the post-beginners, the first semester of post-beginners. So typically the students have done 2 semesters, so a first year of Italian. And in those subjects, the approach there is a pretty traditional textbook-driven explicit instruction sort of approach. So, they learn the forms, they learn, communicative routines, whatever it might be. Then they got to me and because of my shift in pedagogical thinking, a completely different approach. Essentially, it's actually 4 hours a week for 12 weeks, not 3 hours. I forgot 1 hour. I just remembered it before. So it's actually 4 hours a week for 12 weeks. So not a bad amount of contact time, but bear in mind it's only 12 weeks. Essentially, I had one class, a 2-hour block, which was a story listening class. And in that class, essentially, we would go in and just tell stories in Italian. And then there'd be some global comprehension activities. This is a particular approach, and I've got the links there, but I'll make sure you can get a look at those afterwards. As well as this 2-hour story listening class, there were a series of lectures in Italian on a range of different topics. And that was a CLIL sort of approach. So content deployed in Italian. And then there was a 1 hour a week sort of practical class on a range of topics. No explicit language instruction whatsoever. So no teaching of grammar at all. I didn't teach one bit of anything. None of that reading a story, then go to the board and explain some grammar point. Nothing. None of it. No explicit language instruction whatsoever. One of the things that was really important for me was to get the students reading as well. So one of their assessment tasks was a weekly reading log, which prescribed a particular amount of reading. Basically, they had to read at least 2 short stories or 2 chapters of a book each week. Assessment tasks were built around these sort of global comprehension story listening activities. So there was alignment between the types of activities that we were doing in class and the types of things that I was asking them to do for assessment. So it wasn't like we were doing that and then I was asking them to do fill in the blank grammar exercise for their assessment. So there was, I'd aligned the assessment tasks with the pedagogical approach. As well as this, we had the opportunity to do a virtual language exchange between my students and some senior secondary school students in Italy. So that this was a bilingual exchange, so speaking both English and Italian. And the other key thing is I also had the students read some of the theoretical work that was underpinning my approach so that they could see why I'd made the decisions that I'd made. What I expected was a pushback due to the lack of sort of grammar teaching, low level of interest and enthusiasm. I was actually preparing myself for a tough time. I was going, this is going to be tough. What actually happened was maybe at the start there was a bit of, well, this is different from last year. But by the end of semester, there was universal enthusiasm. And this is not an exaggeration. I tracked this through the semester through a number of reflective tasks that the students had to do. There was a really strong engagement with the reading component. I was really surprised, actually. Some students took it on in a way that I was really not expecting. One student wrote something along the lines of, I'm a science student it's a long time since I've been reading, but this has really brought me back to my love of reading, and I really can't believe that I stopped reading. A lot of explicit realization of the benefits of this type of pedagogical approach, and really important, a reduction in anxiety, which led to an increase in desire to participate. I've just put here a couple of quotes, which I'll just put on the screen there and let you read while I just finish my coffee, which is now cold, but good nonetheless. Hopefully you're through that one. I'm going to scroll to the next one. Hopefully you've managed to read through that. I think that, the key sort of messages for me here, I think the key message for me is that if we set up the environment well, students can thrive. Something else the research tells us is that time's important. And one of the things Krashen talks about is about using the time that we have to provide compelling input rather than doing things, he actually says boring stuff, rather than doing things that don't actually lead to providing a sort of input rich environment. And again, Lightbone and Spada have a recent paper talking about this. Here's a quote that I love from Krashen. I'll just read it. I can share two mystical, amazing facts about language acquisition. First, language acquisition is effortless. It involves no energy, no work. All an acquirer has to do is understand messages. Second, language acquisition is involuntary. Given comprehensible input and a lack of effective barriers, language acquisition will take place. The acquirer has no choice. But I think this is something that's really interesting to think about. That's sort of all I wanted to say. So I'm happy to open up the floor now for a bit of conversation. I'll stop sharing my screen, and maybe I'll just I'll just have a look at the chat for a second, and see if we've got any questions.
Matt,
yes.
I just wanted to, while you're looking at the chat, I thought it'd be a good time to just emphasize, well, actually repeat, if anyone is after the recording of this, and the materials that you mentioned before, I've just provided my email. So anyone that wants anything, just email me and I'll send it to you. I'll send you links to the materials. Matt will be sharing very kindly the video and the presentation as well.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Yeah.
A couple of questions in here. So Claire's saying, so instead of speaking and writing, reading is more important on the language learning improvement. Absolutely, absolutely. The sort of orthodoxy that that we've all been schooled in is that students need to speak and write, and that's how they're going to improve. But actually, there's clear evidence that increasing reading and increasing exposure to the languages has this run-on effect to speaking and writing. And it's interesting because I've been thinking about it a lot with with just students in general, university students in general. They don't read as much, and I mean in English, they don't read as much as they used to. And so, this next question about when do you build vocabulary, is it before grammar or after? The reading brings the vocabulary. And this is in any language. I'm often talking in English with my students, and I'll say words that my students that I think's a normal word, and they've never heard before. I was an avid reader when I was younger, and that's where my vocabulary came from. It didn't come from doing, vocab lists and whatever you have in English. It came from reading widely. So, yeah, I absolutely think that reading is the key. Laura is asking whether these ideas are applicable to children in the early years. Absolutely, absolutely. There's clear work that the best way to learn how to read, and this sounds circular, the best way to learn how to read is to read. So if kids can read, and depending on what language you're dealing with, literacy rates are different. Yeah, if you can get the reading going, absolutely. So Berghofer says input needs to be in the zone of proximal development to be effective. Okay, that's fine. The notion of the zone of proximal development, that's fine. How do you measure that for a class of 20 people? Because everyone's zone of proximal development is different. Now, the response to that is by providing a range of interesting, compelling, language-rich texts, you'll hit the zone of proximal development for the majority. If it's too hard for that person, they'll just ignore it. If it's at the right stage for another person, they'll be able to take it in. So there's no way we can measure someone's zone of proximal development. So the response to that is provide a language, an environment that's full of rich, compelling language. Yeah, Helen says if we're moving towards a non-textbook format, why is it so hard to find appropriate storybooks to build confidence in a language? So a lot of proponents of the sort of story-orientated methods advise using sort of traditional fables and that sort of thing. These are pretty easy to find online. One of the things that I used with my students as well, the ones that were maybe a little bit stronger, was I suggested they could read a book that they know well in English in translation. So depending on sort of what level you're talking about, you might be able to find material. I'm happy to talk about this further with people, and I'll just put my email in there. So feel free to email me if you want to discuss further. Okay, 1,000 questions coming in. Fiona, okay, so one of the things I'm thinking about is being a little bit more, designing a bit more research around what I'm doing to exactly measure this. I've got some preliminary work from this group that I worked with in first semester. We did an interesting task towards the end of the semester where I told the story that I'd created, and it didn't have an ending, and they had to write the ending. And the written, so they had to physically write it, and I've collected those samples, and it was on a preliminary look, I would suggest that there was some strong improvement in their written work there. But as I say, I haven't gone about it systematically yet. What's my favourite exercise for reading? I love just telling people to sit over there and read. That might not work for you in your context. But one of the things that's working really well for me is getting my students to keep a reading log. So whatever they read, they have to write in their reading log a short summary of that, and I emphasize short. So, if they read a short story, I only want 2 to 3 sentences summarizing that, and it can be in English, in Italian, or in a combination of the languages. I don't particularly care. But that's actually working really well, both as a way to keep them motivated, because they've got to do it on a weekly sort of rotation. And it also gives me a bit of an insight into what they're doing. Melissa, what type of text did you get them to read? And was I conscious of the cognitive load? So it's interesting. There's differing views on this. The most, and this is the view that I probably follow as well. The most extreme view is you just leave it up to the students to sort of sort that out for themselves. So far that's been working okay. What I've been recommending to them is Italian fairy tales and fables as a starting point, and the weaker students tend to like these because they know the story already. They're not a challenging length. Typically, they're pretty contained in length. And then students that are up for a bit more of a challenge, or the students that start out with those fables and then sort of graduate, if you like, to something more, I recommend to them, a range of easy readers in Italian. I've got some that I can suggest. And typically also contemporary Italian narrative. And this is the key thing with Mason and Krashen's sort of approach to this, is that students should be reading narrative fiction. They shouldn't be reading sort of newspaper articles or anything like that, because fiction gives that wide range of compelling and language-rich input. Let's see how we're going. Yeah, so I do read aloud in class. Yeah, so that's what the story listening is. I actually go into class and just tell stories. And that involves sometimes it's a little bit performative, I use different comprehension aids as well. Sometimes I do some bad drawings sometimes. Sometimes I write some words. I act it out a little bit. Yeah. Some might find it hard to find stories in their language. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Okay, one of the things I'd suggest is if it's a language that's supported by a particular community, that one of the things you can do is start to document stories and use those. So if they're not already printed, they don't have to be printed, but you can sort of transcribe them yourself and use them. The question about disability, I can't respond to. I guess, I mean, university students are slightly, I mean, they're broad ranging. I've had a couple of students with particular anxiety sort of disorders, if you like, who have responded really well to this sort of approach because it doesn't target them. It doesn't target them. I think I've answered all of those. Do I translate the readings? No, I don't translate the readings. It all sort of happens in Italian. It can be a bit mediated, but yeah, I don't tend to translate the stories. My email address is there, and as I said, I'm very happy always to respond to any questions. Final question here from Simone: how do you develop depth for your students' language? There's a great paper on Krashen's website about developing high-level language, and this is basically through traveling through narrative fiction. So it's clear actually that to develop depth, if you provide this sort of input of compelling, rich language, it actually leads to broader and deeper language capacity. If anyone wants to ask a question in their voice, I'm still here. Otherwise, there we go.
Hi, Matt.
Yes.
Do you have experience working with the disability children, for example, ADHD? That I find very difficult to let them sitting, focus to the reading.
Yeah. So I can absolutely understand that would be challenging. I mean, I think, yeah, this is not an area where I'm an expert, but there is some material on that. If you send me an email, I'll follow that up with you.
Okay, that's from WAOD. From yep.
No
Thank you so
worries.
much. Thank you so much,
pleasure.
Matt. Thanks.
Yeah, Melissa, there's lots of work on it. I'll put something in for Alex to have a look at. Thank you very much for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to know that you're doing the fantastic work that you do. And yep, I wish you the very best in this very strange and weird period.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to repeat for those of you who may have missed out. Matt's spoken for us before, both at our conference when we used to meet face to face, and also he's provided a lecture. I think it was last lockdown, but and we've recorded his previous session, and Matt very generously provided us with quite a bit of material. Although Matt does speak about the Italian language, but we have to use one other language, so it is one of his specialties. So you'll find that the material does make reference to that, but it's still very, very interesting. And for those of you who are also interested, Matt did mention also, you mentioned Matt, passion. we had Benito Mason, and I know that Matt was also present at that one there. And we have recordings and her presentation also available. So if you wanted to go in depth into what Matt was talking about this evening, please go to the YouTube channel that we've got, the Federation's YouTube channel. Email me and I'll provide you with the materials. And have a look online in our Google Classroom. Email me again, I'll provide you with the details. And you'll find loads and loads of very, very easy to follow and very, very useful material with regards to what we've been discussing this evening. Matt, thank you very, very much. We'll let you get back to dinner. And
dinner's done and dusted. Now it's just on the couch.
Enjoy the couch.
Cheers.
I'm going off to my dinner. But everybody, I'd like to, on behalf of everyone, again, Matt, it was very, very interesting. Thanks for showing us another perspective of what we can do in our community languages classrooms. And we will see everybody hopefully at our next session. Good evening, everyone.
Thank
See you
you.
again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, mate. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Grazie.
Grazie, buonasera. Bye.
Matt, Per,
Thank you.
before you go, can I ask you a question? Because
Absolutely.
you just now you emphasized the importance of reading, but you did not because I had Chinese background. Most of